As anthropologists, we know that humans have a unique capacity for culture. While other animals might have some culture-like characteristics, we do culture in a much more elaborated way. And although cultures look different from place to place, we know that every human has the same ability to do culture. So one of the questions we might want to ask is, where did we get culture from? How did we develop culture within our lineage? Why do we have it and other animals do not? Otherwise, we could ask this as, what is the evolution of culture? Now, we've already discussed the characteristics that define culture. Culture is learned, it's symbolic, it's shared, etc. But where do we see these first instances of all of these elements of culture showing up? For this, we have to turn to a lot of different data sets. We can look at the archaeological record, we can look at how humans and animals live today, and when we combine that, a clearer picture starts to emerge of where culture has come from. The first place we can start is by looking at modern human groups that are alive today. And we can see that there's incredible diversity in the types of cultures that exist. Some people live rather simple lives as hunter-gatherers, or at least outwardly simple, so small groups of people who don't have a lot of personal belongings or extremely elaborated technology. Some people are shepherds, some are farmers, and some live in very large urban centers like New York City, where you have millions of people crammed into a relatively small space. It's sometimes appealing or compelling to think of these different types of human societies as representing stages in human cultural evolution. That is, that given enough time, every human society will sort of end up here. We've just had to work ourselves through these stages of getting bigger and more complex. The problem with this type of thinking, which is referred to as unilineal evolutionism, meaning one line, all humans evolving along one single trajectory. The problem with this type of thinking is that, first of all, not every group of humans wants to end up in this very complex, urban, industrialized setting. Many people, most people, are quite happy not living in this environment. So to suggest that everyone will eventually get here really denies the agency of the people within cultures. Second of all, assuming that everyone eventually ends up here is somehow suggesting that everyone who is not already in the industrialized world somehow represents previous points in human cultural evolution, as though other people are somehow a stage behind where some of us are today. That's a very ethnocentric way of viewing the world. And it really doesn't take into account all of the complexities that drive cultures to adapt in their own particular way. So as anthropologists, we want to reject this idea of unilineal evolutionism. If we're talking about how culture came about, we have to also consider why culture might look different from place to place. So to first start with this question of where do we get culture, why do we see it in our lineage and not in others, let's start by positioning us, the humans, within our larger family group. As humans, we are primates. So the primates include monkeys, they include apes like gorillas and chimpanzees, also lemurs and tarsiers and lorises. There are lots of primates that are living today. We're going to focus right now, though, on just the apes. So this particular diagram, this is called a cladogram. A cladogram is just a way of representing the evolutionary relationships of a group of animals or plants. And we could fill this up with, any groups of animals that we wanted to show how they are related to one another. But for our purposes, we're going to be looking just at the apes. So along the top here, this represents the modern day, and we're going to be positioning the ape groups that are alive today up here. As you continue down the cladogram, this represents periods deeper in time. Now on the left to right axis is evolutionary distance. So the further apart two groups, the more distantly related they are to one another. Let's go ahead and fill in this cladogram for the living apes. So we've got 6 groups of apes that are alive today. Starting on the left, we've got the gibbons. The gibbons are also known as the lesser apes because they're much smaller than the rest of the apes that are alive today. Then we have the orangutans, which live in Southeast Asia, the gorillas from Africa, the bonobos and chimps, also from Central Africa, and finally humans. Now when we see all of these lines on the cladogram, where the lines connect, that suggests a point in the past where there was an ancestor group. So for example, thinking about the chimpanzees and bonobos right here. Bonobos are often called the pygmy chimpanzees. They're a little bit smaller than sort of the normal chimps that we think of. They also live in female-dominated groups, and they're much more peaceful compared to chimpanzees, which are male-dominated and much more aggressive. The two lines between bonobos and chimps join here, which tells us that at some point in the past, probably in the last couple million years, bonobos and chimpanzees shared an ancestor. So this was a time when there were no bonobos and no chimps, but some ancestor group that then split into two, and then each of those two groups diverged and they evolved in their own way. Similarly, this point here, where we see the connection between the chimp-bonobo line and the human line, tells us that at some point in the past, about 7 million years ago, humans, bonobos, and chimps all shared a single ancestor. So none of those three groups were alive. There was just this sort of grandfather species that split into two. One of those groups, or one half of that group, became the humans, the other half became the bonobos and the chimpanzees. Now we want to subdivide this group of apes into some smaller groups. We already mentioned that the gibbons are known as lesser apes because they're smaller, only about 10 to 25 pounds full grown, whereas all of the rest of the apes here are a lot larger. So we call those the great apes, or the hominids with an IDS. Hominids are all of the great apes, so everyone except gibbons, and also all of the ancestors that have existed along their evolutionary history. So we are, as humans, we are apes, and we are also hominids. There's one more subdivision to make here, and that is the hominins with an INS. We are the only living hominins on the planet today. But over the past approximately 7 million years, there have been many, many different hominin species. This star represents our last common ancestor with bonobos and chimps. So again, this is that grandfather species that was alive approximately 7 million years ago that split into two. Half went on to evolve to become humans, and the other half evolved into the bonobos and the chimpanzees. Thinking specifically of that hominin line that has been diverged from chimpanzees and bonobos and evolving in their own trajectory for the last 7 million years, here we see a timeline of some of the hominin species that have existed. So 7 million years is over here on the right. Here is our potential last common ancestor. It's a fossil group called Sahelanthropus chadensis. So we think this might have been the grandfather of both us and chimps and bonobos. As we continue through time to the present, we see lots of different hominin groups. And then finally at the very end here, we have the Homo sapiens, meaning us, the humans. So while we've been split from the rest of the apes for a long time, our species only evolves relatively recently. But all of us are still hominins. So if we agree that we have this last common ancestor with chimpanzees, and for now, Sahelanthropus chadensis is the best candidate for that position. This is the Sahelanthropus chadensis skull. It was found in Chad, which is a country in sort of northern Africa, about 20 years ago. Sahelanthropus chadensis has a lot of ape-like characteristics. It's got this big brow ridge, it's got very apey teeth, but it also has some human characteristics. One of them being a hole in the skull where the spinal cord inserts that's more similar to what we would see in a human. So it looks like this might be that grandfather species, or our last common ancestor. This is an artist's reconstruction of Sahelanthropus chadensis. We don't know exactly what they look like because, of course, they're not alive anymore. They went extinct a long time ago. But this is what we think it might have looked like. So if we agree that this is a human ancestor, and we also agree that all humans have culture, is that enough to say that Sahelanthropus chadensis also had culture? Well, probably not, because all we have to represent this species are a few fossils. And it's impossible to see culture in a fossil or in a bone, because culture is about behavior. So this skull isn't telling us anything about the behavior of this species, and we don't have any other types of artifacts that tell us what they were actually doing. So did this group have culture? There's not any evidence to suggest they did. So at this point, we don't have enough to say, yes, they absolutely did. Let's move forward in time a little bit more. to about 3.5 million years ago. Now at this time in Africa, there are a number of hominin species, but one of them is a group that we call Australopithecus afarensis. This individual is nicknamed Lucy, and if you've heard about a fossil hominin before, you've probably heard about Lucy. She's one of the most famous fossil hominins ever discovered. She was found in the 1970s, and she was the most complete fossil hominin ever found up to that point. A few years later, in Tanzania in East Africa, a set of footprints were found embedded into volcanic ash crossing the African savanna. So basically, a volcano erupted, and the ash fell on the ground, and then 3 members of this group, Australopithecus afarensis, walked across that ash. It rained a short time after that, which turned the ash into solid rock, preserving these footprints for 3.5 million years. Now we see some big footprints and some small footprints. This looks very much like a group of individuals walking together, and it could very well be a family group. And this looks like, it's hard not to look at this and see something very human if you see a family out for a walk together. So if we say this is a family, is this enough to say that by 3.5 million years ago, we're seeing evidence for culture in these fossilized footprints? Again, probably not. Although this is behavior, it's walking, lots of animals walk, and lots of animals live in family groups. And so it's not really showing us anything special or anything unique. It's definitely cool that these footprints are found, but it's not telling us really about the behavior and the cultural behavior of these individuals. If we really want to try to identify some of the first elements of culture in the hominin lineage, we need to look for indicators of behavior like tool making. The earliest tools that we have are stone tools about 3.3 million years old. We call these Lamequian tools, and these were actually only found a few years ago. Prior to that, we thought these were the oldest type of stone tools. These are called Oldowan tools, and we see them in East Africa starting about 2.6 million years ago. But the recent discovery of Lamequian tools pushes the technology of tool making back almost another million years. Now, I think this is a really strong indicator for early elements of culture. Stone tools are complex enough in making them that it really requires some sort of transmission of knowledge, meaning you have to teach someone how to do this, and you have to be taught how to do it by someone else. And we know that culture is learned. So here we see evidence for learning. We also see the evidence of sharing information. This is adaptive because it would have helped our ancestors access more food resources in their environment. So we're already checking off some of those characteristics of culture just by seeing these first earliest stone tools. However, we don't see any evidence for symbolism. And as we know, symbols are a huge part of human culture. Every element of our culture has extra symbolic layers on top of it, and we don't see evidence for symboling in these more simple stone tools. So this might be the beginning of culture, but it's still not full-blown culture. It's also important to remember that when we're looking at early culture, it's represented by only very small pieces of data. We really only have stone tools and then also the bones that were butchered with those stone tools to serve as evidence for early cultural development. So here you see some stone tools that have existed 2.5 million years ago, 1 million years ago, 10,000 years ago. We can see that they're getting more complex and more refined over time. We can look at animal bones that have been chopped open to get to the marrow inside, or that have been cut by stone tools to access the meat. These are the tiny bits of evidence that we have to go on in order to study early culture. So much of what we know is based on inference. We take these small pieces of data and then try to build a larger narrative about what that means. To assess our ability to have culture and the development of culture, another data set that we want to bring in is a comparison to our closest living relatives, the other primates. So we already positioned ourselves within the ape group, but now we're going to consider primates more generally. So that includes apes and monkeys and some of the other primates like lemurs and lorises and tarsiers. Humans share with other primates a couple of key characteristics. We all have increased manual dexterity, increased memory capabilities, and altricial young. And we'll go through these one by one. First of all, humans and most primates have increased manual dexterity, including opposable thumbs. This opposable thumbs, sometimes people think that this is something that only humans do. Opposable thumbs just means that we can touch our thumbs to every one of our fingertips. We have a grasping hand. All primates have this grasping hand because our primate ancestors about 60 million years ago used those grasping hands and thumbs to hold onto tree branches. Today, we use our thumbs for things like holding pens and pencils, texting our friends, braiding hair. Most of the things that we do that involves our hands, we use these opposable thumbs. So our hand design has definitely enabled our culture, but it's not unique to us. All primates have these wonderful, fancy hands. Primates also all have increased memory capabilities compared to other mammals and other animals. And in particular, we're looking at the part of the brain that's responsible for memory and for social memory. That is the neocortex. So throughout primates, we all have larger brains than the rest of the animal kingdom, but in particular our neocortex is larger. And for humans, we have the largest neocortex for our body size compared to all other primates. A few years ago, a couple decades ago, some anthropologists looked at the size of the neocortex relative to the group size that primates were living in. And what they found was that the larger the neocortex in a primate, the larger the social group they lived in. And it's important to have good social memory if you're living in a large social group because you need to be able to remember all of your interactions with all of the individuals in your group. For example, if I'm a little monkey and I have a piece of fruit that I want to share with a friend, I want to make sure that I give it to the monkey who was sharing fruit with me yesterday, not the monkey that pushed me out of a tree. So we use this large neocortex to have larger social groups, which also means that part of our evolutionary history is for being social. That's one really important element of being human, is that we need to be social with each other. We work best when we engage our brains in social interaction. Finally, humans and other primates have altricial young. This means that our babies are born kind of helpless. They can't do a lot for themselves. We have to feed them, we have to carry them, we have to protect them. We have to do everything for them in the first couple months or years of their life. And again, this is true of all primates, whether you are a human, an orangutan, or a baboon. The reason why our babies are born pretty helpless is because of those large brains. Essentially, mothers don't have the energetic resources to stay pregnant long enough to support developing a big baby primate brain. So mothers have to give birth to babies whose brains have not finished growing. And then most of that brain growth happens after birth. We can compare this to animals like horses, deer, elephants. All of those animals, when they're born, their brains are pretty much developed, and they can already get up and start moving around within a few hours of birth. We call that precocious young. So humans and other primates have altricial young. We have to be taken care of by our parents, by our families for the first couple years of life, but that's also okay because that's the period of time where we go through the enculturation process, right? That's when we learn our culture. There are a number of things, though, that humans do that are unique, things that we don't share in common with the other primates. So for example, humans cooperate and share much more than other primates do. Here we have a picture of an Amish barn raising, where dozens of people get together to build a barn in a single day. You do not see this level of cooperation in primates. Human women also live past their reproductive age, right? Women go through a period of their life called menopause, and then they survive for several decades after that. We don't see menopause in other primates. For the most part, when a primate female is no longer able to reproduce, that marks the end of her life. There's not really a point in being alive if you are not having babies, if you are a chimp or a monkey or a lemur. But in humans, we do live past the age when we can have babies. So why would that be? Why is it important for women to live past the age when they can have children? The answer is probably something to do with the importance of grandmothers. So grandmothers and grandfathers, being able to help your children take care of their children increases your own sort of evolutionary importance. So it preserves your own genes by making sure that your kids raise their kids successfully. Human women also have concealed ovulation, meaning that we don't advertise when we are able to get pregnant. Other primates, however, do not conceal their ovulation. So here we have a picture of a female chimpanzee, and you'll notice this right down here. This is her genital swelling. Genital swelling is essentially a big advertisement to all the males in the group. Now is the time to get me pregnant. I'm ovulating right now. I got to get pregnant if I'm going to have a baby in the next season. So why don't human women do this? We don't give off any signals to say, I'm ready to get pregnant. It probably has to do with female choice. So for a female chimpanzee like this, when she's giving off this big display that she is in the time of her cycle to get pregnant, she's not really going to have an option. She's not going to get to choose which male it is gets her pregnant. She'll get pregnant by whatever male gets to her at the right time, whatever male is able to keep her away from everyone else, but the choice is not hers. However, in human women, because we can hide ovulation from those around us, we have more choice in who we mate with when we mate with them. So female choice is probably a driving evolutionary factor here. Finally, humans have much more complicated kinship systems, meaning we recognize more members of our family, and we have more symbolic relationships around those family relationships, and we get married. Every human society has some form of marriage, although it looks different from place to place. Primates don't do that. It would be adorable to see a chimpanzee in a tuxedo, but primates do not get married. So while there are a number of things that we share with our primate relatives because of our shared evolutionary history, there are also a number of things that humans do that are unique. If we look specifically at chimpanzees, we can see that they do have many characteristics in their behavioral repertoire that are very culture-ish. Many chimpanzee groups make and use tools. So some chimps crack open nuts with two stones called anvils and hammerstones. That's what we see up here. A mother chimp using two rocks, and then she'll set a nut in between them to crack it open. And then those nuts are eaten by her babies and by herself. Chimps also do something called termite fishing, where they'll take a blade of grass or a little twig, and they'll stick it into an insect mound. As the insects latch onto the stick, the chimps pull it out, and then they can just eat the termites or the insects off of the stick. Chimpanzees also build nests to keep themselves off the forest floor at night. They hunt meat, and one of their favorite things to eat is actually monkey. So they'll go out in these big hunting expeditions and then share meat between themselves. They also throw objects in signs of display. And I've included some YouTube links to videos showing some of these behaviors. Now, very similar to those early stone tool making abilities of our hominin ancestors about 3.3 million years ago, in these chimpanzee behaviors, we see some elements of culture, right? These types of traditions, these behaviors, they require teaching. They require sharing. They're definitely adaptive because they help chimps get more food resources. But just like with those early stone tools 3.3 million years ago, what we're missing here are symbols. We don't have any evidence that in the wild, chimpanzees create and use symbols. So if we were to ask the question, do chimps have culture, we could answer this in a variety of ways. You could support an answer that chimps have some characteristics of culture, but they still are lacking this one very, very important element, which is symbols. Now, turning specifically to humans, we know that humans first evolved in Africa. Until very recently, the earliest human fossils, so the earliest Homo sapiens fossils, were found here in Ethiopia in East Africa at a site called Omo Kibish, and they were about 200,000 years old. So it has been the predominant story for a while now that all humans evolved in East Africa about 200,000 years ago. Now, in 2017, not too long ago, new fossils were identified from Morocco at a site called Jebel Irhoud. Those fossils are about 300,000 years old. So that pushes back the evolution of Homo sapiens another 100,000 years into the past. And it's likely that as we continue doing research, the story of when and where exactly humans evolved is going to be changing a bit here and there. But it's pretty certain, I'm going to say with 98% confidence, that the first humans, the first Homo sapiens who looked like us, who have the same proportions, the same basic physical characteristics, the same anatomical characteristics, those all come from Africa around 300,000 years ago. If we look at the genes of humans all over the world today, the genetic patterns suggest that all humans do come from Africa at least 200,000 years ago. Okay, so basically we all come from here, and then over time, some populations have spread out from Africa. So we have an African ancestor, all of us, and then some groups have spread on and have carried their genes into new places. And so we can use DNA to reconstruct those migration paths. So it's very clear that we have this African ancestry. So it should be pretty obvious then that culture comes from Africa, right? If all humans come from Africa and all humans have culture, then, all right, culture comes from Africa. And yet, there has been a lot of debate around this fact over, the history of anthropology and archaeology. And so we need to bring in some of that history to sort of understand the state of the debate. In the early days of archaeological research, most people who practiced archaeology were European and some Americans. But these were people who were French, German, English, and they tended to focus their research on those countries, on Western Europe. Now, for hundreds of years, people have known that there were these beautiful cave paintings in places like France and Spain and Germany. There are really beautiful artifacts that have been discovered in these places, including really nice stone tools and elements of personal ornamentation. So these would be like pendants that you could put on a necklace. All of these things are clearly symbolic, right? A symbol is something that represents something else. This picture of a horse represents a horse, and maybe it represents something else as well. But here we have very, very clear symboling, and symbols are an essential part of the definition of culture. Now, all of these discoveries that have been located in Europe date to 40,000 years ago or less. Okay, so just to recap, we have humans in Africa 300,000 years ago looking fully human, so physically human. But it's not until 40,000 years ago in Europe that we see humans acting fully symbolic and culture-y. So how do we explain that? Well, for the early archaeologists, it made perfect sense to them because these were Western European men and they had preconceived ideas about how great it was to be European, right? They would look at these things and they'd say, well, if we want to understand humanity, like, of course, this is what we're going to focus on. And this supported their own ideas of the importance of Europe because they already had ideas about sort of a hierarchy of human evolution and human culture in which they were positioned at the top. Now, if this sounds problematic, it's because it is, right? There's something that really needs to be questioned further because there's a lot of bias going into this. Africa, by comparison, did not see a lot of archaeological research, and those people who did go to Africa trying to understand human prehistory found a very different sort of archaeological record. They weren't seeing these big, beautiful cave paintings. They weren't seeing all of these instances of personal ornamentation. Instead, a lot of people were finding just kind of grotty-looking rocks. I mean, some of these are stone tools, but they don't look all of that impressive. Now, this is a collection that was collected by a British guy in southern Africa, in the country of Zimbabwe, about 100 years ago. These collections are now stored at the American Museum of Natural History here in New York City. But there just wasn't as much emphasis on studying Africa because people already assumed that Europe was the most important part in the story of human evolution. And so there came to be this belief that although we all evolved in Africa, physically evolved in Africa, about 200,000 years ago, or maybe a little bit before, that we didn't culturally evolve until much later, around 40,000 years ago, and we see that in Europe. So there's this big gap between when our bodies evolved and when our brains evolved. And this is called the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. The Upper Paleolithic is a period of time in Europe, starting about 40,000 years ago, when you see humans doing these really beautiful, complex things. So this Upper Paleolithic Revolution was based on what archaeologists were finding in Europe. And so they developed a sort of list of traits that you should expect to find whenever you have humans who are fully culturally evolved. Things like personal ornaments, or art, or blade stone tools, which is like a specialized kind of stone knife. You'd see people eating more types of foods and having more distinct regional technologies. So it's like each culture, each group had its own specific way of doing things. So people would take this set of characteristics and then try to apply it to the rest of the world. And when they didn't find all of these things in Africa or Asia or Australia, they would say, see, it's because only Europe has this modern behavior. We see it there first. So again, it supported the idea that the first truly, fully modern cultural humans came from Europe or developed in Europe or Asia. It supported that idea of European cultural superiority. So one more time, if you have a problem with this idea, then you're on the right track. This is a very problematic idea. Some anthropologists have tried to find a way around what are the very obvious ethnocentric and even racist implications of the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. So one of those alternatives is called the genetic brain rewiring hypothesis. This is the idea that around 45 or 50,000 years ago, a light switch sort of turned on in the brains of humans all over the world. And that light switch turning on, that was the culture switch. And so with that culture switch comes symbolism, it comes language. And so it was just this, like, everywhere in the world, people suddenly became smart. And I mean, it's not really sudden. It's basically suggesting that, you know, we have humans in East Africa who spread out throughout the world, and then in one of those groups, there's a genetic mutation that causes someone to become smart and cultured. And then that genetic mutation spreads into the rest of the world by populations breeding with each other and spreading that positive genetic adaptation. The problem with this is that people have arrived in Australia by at least 50,000 years ago and probably quite a bit earlier. But it seems from all the evidence that we have that once humans made it into Australia, sea level rose and basically cut them off from the rest of the world. And so if that genetic adaptation, if that genetic light switch flipped on after Australia's cut off from the rest of the world, then that beneficial, smart genetic component would never have been able to make it to Australia, which means that Australians would have been sort of left out of that cultural light switch being turned on. And we know that's not true. We know that Indigenous Australians have the exact same capacity for culture as any other human. So the genetic brain rewiring hypothesis is a good attempt to try to explain cultural development, but it doesn't quite get us to where we need to be. Instead, we can turn to an idea that was really synthesized and put forth only in the year 2000, which is really not that long ago. And it was in a paper called The Revolution That Wasn't. This is in reference again to that Upper Paleolithic Revolution. So these two authors, Alison Brooks and Sally McBrearty, said in this really big comprehensive paper that what we see when we look at the archaeological record, it's not that smart, cultured, intelligent, modern humans suddenly start acting smart and intelligent and cultured in Europe 40,000 years ago just because, because they became smart at that moment, but rather that all of those things that seemingly made European humans very smart and cultured and modern, those all actually developed in Africa much earlier. And so it's not that humans suddenly become smart with a snap of the fingers when they get to Europe, it's that they have been becoming cultured. They had been becoming intelligent throughout tens of thousands of years of evolution in Africa. All of those cultural characteristics accumulate over time. Okay? So what this chart is showing us are all of the characteristics that had been thought to represent true cultural activity in humans. The red box represents 40,000 years ago, okay? And that was the time when these traits appear in Europe. But what we see is that on these black lines, we see the length of the trait existing in Africa. And each one of these things that supposedly made humans in Europe really, really smart actually existed in Africa for much, much longer. So beads, they only appear in Europe 40,000 years ago, but they've existed in Africa for 82,000 years. Points are made in Europe 40,000 years ago, but they existed in Africa 250,000 years ago. Blades are, again, these like elongated stone tools that are, a bit difficult to make. They take a very specific set of techniques. We see them in Europe 40,000 years ago, but they extend back in Africa to at least 280,000 years ago, and actually some new finds are pushing that back to 500,000 years ago. So everything that made humans look special in Europe actually existed in Africa much, much earlier. What this means is that to be a cultured, behaviorally modern human is not about being European. It has nothing to do with evolution that took place in Europe. Instead, all of our smarts, all of our ability to have culture comes from the fact that we all evolved in Africa. It comes from our shared African ancestry. So if we want to understand what it means to be a modern, cultured human, we have to focus on Africa. We have to focus on that aspect of our shared ancestry. So why has there been so much privilege given to Europe and not to Africa? Why has Africa been ignored as the source of our cultural innovation? Well, for starters, Africa is huge. Africa is a massive continent, and there hasn't been as much work done in Africa as there have in other parts of the world. So, for example, here is the outline of France set within the African continent. Now, I would guess, but I think it's a pretty good guess, that in just this tiny little corner of France, there have probably been at least 100 different archaeological projects investigating human prehistory there. I would also guess that there have probably been less than 100 archaeological projects in this whole region of sort of southern central Africa. So there's a real disparity in the amount of attention that's been played to Western Europe as opposed to Africa. That means that the record is just biased. We don't have an equivalent amount of data from Africa as we do from other parts of the world, which means that other parts of the world look more important just because more work has been done there. So ultimately, how do we explain the fact that things look very different and they look very sudden in Europe 40,000 years ago, even if we've agreed that all of these cultural elements have developed in Africa at earlier times? Well, for starters, we have to recognize that Europe and Africa are very different places. And so it would be unreasonable to expect that humans living in those two places to do things exactly the same way. If you're living in Europe, there are different things that you have to adapt to in your environment. If you're in Africa, there's a different set of constraints that you have to deal with. So life is going to be different between these two places just automatically because of the environment and the climate. The second part of that is that when those African populations migrated into Europe 40,000 years ago, so that's the first time humans are getting into Europe, they are bringing with them all of the things that they accumulated and learned through their development in Africa. And when they get to Europe, into this new environment, there's already another hominin species there. And those were the Neanderthals. The Neanderthals are our European cousins. So at the time when we were evolving in Africa, Homo sapiens was evolving in Africa, the Neanderthals were evolving in Europe. So when members of our species migrated into Europe, not only did they have to adjust to a new environment, they now had to compete with a species that was very similar to them, and they were already experts at living in that environment. And so they had to adapt culturally very, very quickly. And all of the things that we see in Europe, all of that symbolism that we see with the cave paintings, with the ornamentation, those are all parts of the human survival system in Europe. But it was all things, all characteristics, all abilities that those humans brought with them through their evolutionary history in Africa. Okay? So if we think about this concept of unilineal evolutionism again, thinking back to the very beginning of this video, how do we resist? How do we reject unilineal evolutionism? How do we explain the fact that there are humans who live in very different cultures and very different societies today? It's not that anyone is stuck in the past or anyone is more advanced or less advanced. It's simply that every culture adapts to its own needs. Every group of people has different requirements for survival. Every environment has its own circumstances, and people respond to those circumstances. It's unreasonable to expect folks living in the Kalahari Desert as hunter-gatherers to set up a McDonald's. It just doesn't make sense in that particular cultural setting. So people look different from place to place, not because any one group is more advanced than another, but because we're all equally advanced in finding the best way to meet our own needs. It's kind of amazing. Every culture is an accumulation of thousands of years of adapting to best ensure the group's survival. So it's only reasonable that we look different from place to place. Now, if you want to explore this idea a little bit more, the role of geography and the role of environment in influencing cultures, I'd recommend checking out this book, Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. It's not perfect. There are a lot of anthropologists and archaeologists who disagree with some elements of this book, but it's still a really, I think, cohesive narrative about how geography and climate impact the development of human cultures, and why it is that some human cultures have persisted for a very long time and have acquired a great amount of wealth and power and have ultimately, conquered much of the planet, while others have not. So it's not a perfect book, but it gives us a really nice sort of framework for understanding how important environment and climate is on the development of human cultures. So to sum this all up, the evolution of culture, where did it come from? When did it come from? Culture, as we see it in humans today, is absolutely the result of our evolution within the African continent. As humans have been spread out throughout the African continent for the last 300,000 years, groups have developed different strategies, different ways of surviving and coping and thriving in their environments. This slow accumulation of characteristics is ultimately what ended up being transported to other parts of the world. So as humans have migrated out of Africa, they've taken their cultural capabilities with them elsewhere. Culture truly did evolve within our shared African ancestry, and any culture that we see around the world today is due to the very specific and wonderful circumstances of our African evolution.